I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was in the office, finishing up the bank statement and wondering if the world outside West 35th Street still existed when the doorbell rang. It wasn't the usual sort of ringed kind that suggests a bill collector or a nervous widow. It was a rhythmic, insistent pulse that told me whoever was on the stoop felt they had a standing appointment with destiny. I glanced at the clock. It was 10:14 a.m. Nero Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms where he had been since 9, probably telling an odontoglossum that its sepals were unsatisfactory. He wouldn't be down until 11. I crossed the hallway, took a look through the one-way glass in the front door, and saw a woman who looked like she'd been assembled by a very expensive, very tired architect. She was wrapped in charcoal silk that cost more than my first car, and her face was a masterpiece of controlled panic. I opened the door. "Mr. Wolfe is busy with his orchids," I said, giving her my best I am helpful but immovable smile. "I'm Archie Goodwin. If it's a matter of life or death, you can tell me. If it's just life, you'll have to wait 46 minutes. She didn't smile back. She didn't even look at me. Her eyes went straight past my shoulder into the hallway, scanning the sanctuary of the brownstone as if she expected to find a ghost lurking by the coat rack. "My name is Elena Vane," she said. Her voice was low, like a cello played in a small room. "And it isn't death I am worried about, Mr. Goodwin. It's the silence that follows. Someone is stealing my husband's mind, and he's been dead for 3 days. I led her into the office. She sat in the red leather chair, the one that has seen more tears and lies than a confessional, and refused to take off her gloves. I sat at my desk, flipped open my notebook and waited. "Start with the mind-stealing," I suggested. "It's a better hook than the weather." "My husband was Dr. Arthur Vane," she began, her fingers twitching against her handbag. "He was a research chemist for Sterling Harris. He died Friday night. Heart attack, doctors said. He was 62, overworked, and fond of butter." No one questioned it. "Except you," I noted. "I didn't question the death. I questioned the safe. Arthur kept a private laboratory in our basement. He was working on a stabilization formula something that would revolutionize synthetic insulin production. It's worth millions. This morning, I opened his wall to retrieve his will. The will was there. His journals were there. But the formulae final, verified results was gone." I leaned back. "Theft is a job for the police, Mrs. Vane. Mr. Wolfe generally prefers puzzles that the precinct can't solve with a fingerprint kit. The safe wasn't blown," she said sharply. "It wasn't picked. The combination was known only to 3 people, Arthur, myself, and his senior partner, Marcus Thorne. But there is something else, something that shouldn't be there." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small glass vial. It was empty, save for a faint crystalline residue clinging to the bottom. "I found this tucked behind the humidistat in the lab," she said. "Arthur was a fanatic about order. He never left equipment out, and he never worked with arsenic derivatives at home. This vial contains traces of a compound he hasn't touched in 10 years. The elevator hummed. That meant the grand migration had begun. A moment later, 140 kilos of genius and stubbornness appeared in the doorway. Wolfe stopped short, his eyes flicking from me to the woman in the red chair, and finally to the vial on my desk. His lips puckered. He hates surprises, and he particularly hates women who arrive before 11. "Archie," he bellowed, though I was only 10 feet away. "Who is this person?" "Mrs. Elena Vane," I said cheerfully. "She's here because her husband's safe has developed a hole that only lets out $1,000,000 formulas, and because she's found a bottle of old poison where it doesn't belong." Wolfe walked to his desk, which is large enough to serve as a landing strip for a small plane, and sat down. He didn't look at Mrs. Vane. He looked at the vial. He spent a full minute examining it without touching it. His eyes narrowed. "Trifluoromethyl," he muttered, almost to himself. Then he looked at her. "Madame, if your husband died of a heart attack while this substance was in the house, you do not need a detective. You need a mortician with a very thorough understanding of toxicology. Why are you here?" "Because the board of Sterling Harris is meeting on Thursday to announce the formulas sale," she whispered. "If I go to the police, the scandal will freeze the estate for years. I want the formula back, and I want to know if Marcus Thorne killed my husband to get it." Wolfe leaned back, his seventh chin receding into his collar. He hates traffic, he hates nature, and he hates being told what to do. But I saw the way his eyes lingered on the vial. It was a breach of order, a disruption of the natural state of things. Archie, Wolfe said, his voice a low rumble. Check the bank balance for sterling Aris. And tell Fritz we shall have the lamb kidneys for lunch, but he is to be sparing with the rosemary. It's a herb for remembrance, and I suspect we shall have quite enough of that by nightfall. He looked at Mrs. Vane. I will take your retainer, not because of your husband's heart, but because someone has been untidy in their thievery. I cannot abide a messy villain. I poured Mrs. Vane a cup of coffee she didn't drink while Wolfe settled into his oversized chair, a throne of custom-built oak that groaned only slightly under his weight. He didn't look at her, he looked at the far wall, where a map of the world hung, likely contemplating the distance between his office and the nearest source of decent Darjeeling. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming thick and heavy, the kind of silence Wolfe uses to weigh a person's resolve. Mrs. Vane held her ground, her back as straight as a ruler, though her knuckles were white where she gripped her purse. It was a standoff between a woman who had lost everything and a man who refused to lose his composure. Wolfe finally sighed, a sound like a bellows in a quiet forge. He told her that he did not like chemicals, he did not like corporations, and he most certainly did not like the idea of a widow wandering into his home to tell him his business. However, the vial on the desk was an insult to his sense of logic. He asked her to name the playest people who had the combination to that safe and the motive to see Dr. Vane's heart stop beating at such an opportune moment. She gave us 4 names, and as she spoke, I scribbled them into my notebook, already imagining the Miles ID have to put on the Heron to track them down. There was Marcus Thorne, the senior partner who looked like a statesman but acted like a shark, Dr. Aris. The co-founder who had the brains but lacked the stomach for business, Julian Vane. The nephew who lived on a diet of fast cars and bad debts. And finally, Sybil Vance, the head of laboratory security, who was rumored to know where every body and every formula was buried. I noticed Wolfe's eyes flicker when she mentioned the nephew, a tiny movement that meant Head found a thread worth pulling. He told Mrs. Vane to return home and wait for my call, instructing her to act as though the formula were merely misplaced, not stolen. He wanted the thief to feel a false sense of security, which is Wolfe's favorite way of sharpening a knife. Once the front door clicked shut behind her, I turned to the big man. I told him that I had noticed he didn't blink when she mentioned the arsenic derivative, even though it was the most interesting thing in the room. He told me to stop being precocious and get my hat. He wanted me to visit the Vane estate, not to look for the formula hitch he was certain was long gone, but to look for the person who wasn't mourning. He said grief has a definite cadence, and anyone playing the wrong note was our man. I pointed out that it was nearly lunchtime and that Fritz was preparing the kidneys, but Wolfe just waved a hand, a gesture that meant his stomach was currently secondary to his curiosity, a rare and terrifying state of affairs. I headed out into the crisp afternoon air, the city humming with its usual chaotic energy. The Vane estate was a sprawling piece of Gothic gloom tucked away in Westchester, the kind of place that looked like it was designed specifically for reading wills and discovering hidden passages. When I arrived, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive floor wax. I found Marcus Thorne in the library, surrounded by leather-bound books he probably hadn't read. He greeted me with the practiced ease of a man who dealt with investigators for breakfast. He tried to sell me on the idea that Dr. Vane's death was a tragedy of timing, nothing more. He was smooth, perhaps too smooth, like a pebble worn down by a long time in the water. While Thorne was busy explaining the intricacies of synthetic insulin, I kept my eyes moving. I saw Sybil Vance watching us from the doorway, her expression as cold as a laboratory freezer. She didn't say a word, but she didn't have to. Her presence was a warning. I excused myself to use the facilities, and instead took a detour toward the basement lab. The house felt hollow, a shell of wealth built on a foundation of secrets. I didn't find the formula, but I found something else in the trash can near the lab entrance, a crumpled receipt for a floral delivery sent to an address in Queens, dated the day before Dr. Vane died. It wasn't evidence of murder, but in Wolfe's world, there are no coincidences, only connections we haven't mapped out yet. I tucked the slip of paper into my pocket, feeling the first stirrings of the hunt, and headed back to the car. The silence of the estate was beginning to feel less like respect for the dead and more like the quiet of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. I needed to get back to the brownstone. The kidneys would be cold, but the case was finally starting to warm up. By the time I parked the Heron back on West 35th Street, the aroma of Fritz lamb kidneys with rosemary and red wine reduction was already wafting into the hallway, performing a hostile takeover of the premises. I hung my hat and entered the dining room. Wolfe was seated at the head of the table, looking like a Roman emperor who had just conquered a stubborn province. He didn't ask about my trip. The rule is strict. Business is never discussed during a meal. Digestion requires harmony, and murder is notoriously tough on the gastric juices. I ate my kidneys, matched him glass for glass on the Burgundy, and waited until we were back in the office, with Wolfe settled behind his desk and 2 bottles of beer establishing a defensive perimeter in front of him. I gave him the report verbatim, playing back Marcus Thorne's smooth evasions and Sybil Vance's glacial stare. When I mentioned the crumpled floral receipt from the trash, Wolfe's eyes opened a fraction of an inch, the equivalent of an ordinary man leaping out of his chair and shouting bingo. I handed him the slip of paper. He examined it with the distaste he reserved for synthetic fabrics, then dropped it onto his blotter. "Queens," Wolfe murmured, his voice rumbling from deep within his chest. A sentimental or careless gesture. A man who has just successfully orchestrated a synthetic insulin heist does not typically celebrate by sending hydrangeas. Archie, the nephew, Julian Vane. Mrs. Vane mentioned fast cars and bad debts. Find him. He wasn't at the estate, I pointed out, pulling the phone toward me. And if he owes the kind of money that makes a man nervous, he won't be in the phone book. Then use your ingenuity, Wolfe said, closing his eyes and pushing his lips out, a sign he was going to work and expected me to do the same. He is a creature of appetite. Look for places that feed it. It took an hour of calling bookies I tolerate and bartenders I owe favors to, but I found the thread. Julian Vane wasn't hiding in a glamorous speakeasy. He was sweating out a bad run at a mid-tier poker club in Astoria, which happened to be a 10-minute drive from the florist on the receipt. I grabbed my hat a second time that day. The club sat above a dry cleaner, smelling faintly of stale cigars and desperation. Julian sat in a corner booth, staring at his lukewarm highball. He was younger than expected, wearing a suit that had been expensive 3 years ago. I slipped into the booth opposite him. He didn't look up, just curled his hand protectively around his glass. "I am not buying anything," he muttered. "I am not selling," I said, putting my elbows on the sticky table. "I'm Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe. Your aunt hired us. It seems your uncle's safe had a leak, and a lucrative piece of paper washed away. I am taking a poll on who might have needed a sudden influx of cash." Julian finally looked at me, his eyes bloodshot and terrified. "Elena hired a detective. She's out of her mind. Thorne will crucify her, and hell crush me just for talking to you." "Thorne is busy being respectable," I said smoothly. "I am interested in you, Julian. The debt's a public record, but the flowers are a mystery. You sent a bouquet to an address in Queens yesterday. Care to explain why a broke man is buying out the greenhouse?" He flinched, confirming my guess that the receipt was his. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "I was trying to buy some time. The old man, Arthur, didn't invent that stabilizing agent in a vacuum. He stole the baseline data from Dr. Aris 10 years ago. That arsenic derivative, it was Aris' signature compound. I found out and I thought I could leverage it. Squeeze some cash from my beloved uncle to cover my markers, but I didn't kill him. I swear to God I just wanted a piece of the pie. I let him sweat for a few seconds, letting silence do the heavy lifting. He was a small fish swimming in a shark tank, and he knew it. I stood up, tossing $1 on the table for his drink. "Stay out of Westchester," I told him. "And if you remember anything else about Dr. Aris and his old chemicals, call me. Otherwise, the next person asking questions won't be nearly as polite." I left him staring at the dollar and headed out, ready to feed these new angles to Wolfe. The next morning, a thick grey fog rolled off the Hudson, wrapping the sidewalks in a damp chill and doing nothing to improve Wolfe's disposition. He came down from the plant rooms precisely at 11, planted himself behind his desk, and rang for beer. He had spent the evening digesting the news about the nephew and the stolen baseline data, sitting with his eyes closed and his lips moving in and out, performing a silent symphony of deduction. Now, he was ready to issue marching orders. I was instructed to visit Sterling Arris headquarters. Wolfe wanted me to watch Dr. Arris, smell the air he breathed, and determine if a man whose life's work was pilfered a decade ago had finally decided to balance the ledger. Sterling Arris occupied 3 floors of a glass and steel monolith on Lexington Avenue, feeling more like a hospital for robots than a business. The air smelled of synthesized pine and serious money. I bypassed the sleek reception desk, flashed a vaguely official-looking card at a uniformed guard, and took the elevator to the research floor. If the dead man's home laboratory was a quiet retreat, this was an industrial fortress. I navigated a maze of frosted glass corridors until I found the office of Dr. Elias Arris, co-founder and current chief of chemical synthesis. Arris was a fragile-looking man who seemed to be slowly evaporating behind his massive metal desk. Wearing a lab coat that was slightly too large, he possessed the perpetually startled expression of a man who prefers molecules to human beings. I introduced myself, mentioning the widow and missing formula. He offered a sympathetic, nervous flutter of his hands, stating the death was a profound blow to the scientific community. I didn't let him stay comfortable. I pulled my chair closer, lowered my voice, and asked how profound a blow it was to the man whose arsenic derivative baseline had been stolen 10 years prior to make a partner famous. The blood drained from his face so fast, I thought he might faint onto his blotter. He blinked rapidly, fingers tracing the edge of a glass Petri dish on his desk. He didn't deny it. Instead, he let out a ragged sigh, the sound of a decade's worth of resentment finally finding the air. He told me his colleague was a brilliant synthesizer, but a terrible pioneer. The man took Arris' foundational work, tweaked the delivery mechanism, and patented it while Thorne buried Arris in legal threats to keep him quiet. But when I brought up the empty vial found in the basement, the arsenic compound, Arris looked genuinely baffled. He swore he hadn't touched that specific formulation in years, claiming it was unstable and utterly useless for the new insulin stabilizer. Before I could press him further on why a useless poison was sitting in the dead man's home, the office door clicked open. Sybil Vance stood in the frame, wearing a tailored grey suit and an expression that could have frozen mercury. As head of laboratory security, she evidently didn't appreciate private investigators conducting unauthorized therapy sessions with her scientists. She informed me, in a tone requiring no translation, that my presence was a violation of corporate protocol and that Dr. Arris had a board meeting to prepare for. I stood up, giving her a cheerful salute. As I turned to leave, I took one last look around the office. Against the far wall, a row of locked, climate-controlled cabinets housed the active experimental compounds. My eyes caught a discrepancy. The digital log on cabinet number 4, the secure biologicals locker, showed it had been accessed at 2 in the morning on Saturday, just hours after the fatal heart attack. I didn't point it out. I just smiled at the security chief, told Arris to watch his blood pressure, and walked into the sterile hallway. The drive back to the brownstone was slow, the fog turning city traffic into a miserable crawl. I used the time to assemble the pieces. We had a relative desperate for cash, a partner eager to sell a stolen formula, a security chief acting like a guard dog with a guilty conscience, and a wronged scientist claiming ignorance of his own poison. I walked into the office just as Fritz was bringing in a tray of fresh fig pastries. Wolfe looked up from his book, eyes bright with the anticipation of a man who knows the trap is almost set. I poured a glass of milk, sat at my desk, and prepared to ruin his appetite with the news from the laboratory. Wolfe was leaning back in his chair, the light from the desk lamp glinting off the gold of his beer opener. He had listened to my report on the laboratory cabinets and the midnight access log without moving a muscle, save for the rhythmic opening and closing of his eyes. I told him about the cold precision of Sybil Vance and the trembling hands of Dr. Arris. I also mentioned that the air in that office felt like it was primed for an explosion, one where everyone was holding a match and looking for someone else to blame. Wolfe didn't seem impressed by the tension, but he was fascinated by the timing. He reached for a second bottle of beer, poured it with the focus of a chemist, and watched the foam settle. He told me that a man like Aris might be a coward, but a coward with a decade of resentment is a man who has had plenty of time to study the art of the subtle strike. I was about to suggest we call it a night when the sanctity of the brownstone was violated for the second time that day. It wasn't the doorbell this time, but a sound from the kitchen, a sharp, metallic clatter, followed by the kind of silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I didn't wait for Wolfe to give an order. I had my Colt out and was through the door before the echo had died. Fritz was standing by the center island, his face the color of a blanched almond. He was staring at the spice rack, or what was left of it. Someone had smashed a jar of high-grade Telletry peppercorns, but they hadn't just knocked it over. The glass was powdered, and a small rectangular slip of paper had been impaled on the spice hook. I checked the back entrance. The bolt was thrown and the security chain was intact. Checked the basement stairs and the service door. Everything was locked from the inside. Whoever had been in the kitchen had vanished like a puff of smoke, leaving behind a calling card that smelled of crushed pepper and malice. I picked up the note with a pair of grill tongs. It was a single line of type text. The formula is a ghost, and ghosts should not be chased. I walked back into the office and dropped the note on Wolfe's blotter. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look annoyed. He looked at the note, then at me, and then he did something truly alarming. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was the look of a predator who had just seen the bait taken. He told me to put the gun away and tell Fritz to go to bed. The intrusion, he explained, was an act of desperation, not strength. Someone had realized that Nero Wolfe was no longer merely a name on a retainer, but a presence that was beginning to crowd them. The fact that they had entered the house without tripping the alarms meant they were familiar with the layout, or perhaps they had a key. I reminded him that Marcus Thorne had once been a guest here years ago, and Sybil Vance had a professional background in breaking and entering for the sake of security audits. Wolfe shrugged his massive shoulders. He wasn't interested in the how just yet, he was focused on the why. He stressed the note was an endorsement. The formula wasn't just missing, it was a weapon, and the killer was terrified of what would happen when Wolfe figured out its true composition. I sat at my desk and began to cross-reference the names. We had the widow, the partner, the scientist, the security chief, and the nephew. 5 people who had been circling the dead man like vultures. But the note changed the stakes. It meant the formula wasn't just a stabilization agent for insulin. If it were merely a commercial asset, the thief would have been halfway to Zurich by now. Instead, they were lingering, risking a confrontation in Wolfe's own kitchen to warn him off. Wolfe told me to get Saul Panzer on the phone. He wanted Saul to spend the night at the Vane estate, not watching the people, but watching the trash. He wanted every scrap of paper, every discarded vial, and every trace of that arsenic derivative accounted for. As I dialed Saul's number, I looked at Wolfe. He was back to staring at the wall, his mind already 3 moves ahead of the person who had broken his peace. The investigation was no longer about a theft, it was about a murder that was still being committed, 1 hour at a time, in the silence of the brownstone. Panzer arrived at the brownstone at 2 in the morning, looking as inconspicuous as a shadow in a coal cellar. Saul is the only man Wolfe trusts to see what others miss, mostly because he doesn't bother with the obvious. He took his instructions, which involved a very specific and very illegal deep dive into the Vane estate's internal records and physical waste, and vanished back into the fog before the milkman even thought about waking up. I spent the rest of the night on the office sofa with one eye open and the Colt within reach, but the intruder didn't make a return trip. Whoever had smashed the peppercorns had made their point, or so they thought. They hadn't accounted for the fact that when you threaten Nero Wolfe's kitchen, you aren't just poking a bear, you're insulting a god. The next morning, Wolfe was in a state of grim efficiency. He skipped his usual morning pleasantries with the orchids and came down early, his face a mask of granite. He sat at his desk and began a series of phone calls that made my ears perk up. He wasn't talking to chemists or lawyers, he was talking to insurance adjusters and old contacts in the shipping industry. By the time Saul rang the doorbell at noon, Wolfe had a stack of yellow slips covered in his tiny, precise handwriting. Saul looked like he had been dragged through a hedge backward, but he was grinning. He placed a small, soot-stained metal box on my desk. Had found it in the estate's incinerator, caught in the grate before the flames could finish the job. We forced the lock, and inside were the remains of Dr. Vane's personal correspondence card at the edges, but still readable. There was a letter from Marcus Thorne dated 2 weeks ago that wasn't about insulin at all. It was about a failed batch and a liability that needed to be liquidated. But the real prize was a series of handwritten notes by the dead man himself. They were frantic, scrawled by someone who knew their time was short. He wasn't writing about a formula that was killed in silence because it was a poison. He was writing about a formula that was inherently defective. The stabilization agent worked, but only for 72 hours. Then it became a concentrated neurotoxin. Dr. Vane hadn't been murdered because someone wanted his secret. He had been murdered because he wanted to stop the sale. He was the only one with the moral spine to tell the board that their $1,000,000 miracle was actually a death sentence. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes moving over the charred paper with the speed of a hungry hawk. The pieces were finally locking into place. The arsenic derivative ID found wasn't the murder weapon, it was a distraction. A signature meant to frame Dr. Arris if anyone got too curious. The real killer hadn't used a needle or a vial. They had used the company's greed. Thorne needed that sale to go through to save Sterling Arris from a quiet bankruptcy, and Sybil Vance was the one who ensured that security meant silencing any dissenters. But the intruder in our kitchen had been the final mistake. They had been looking for these very papers, realizing that Vane might have kept a backup of his findings. I watched Wolfe's lips move 1, 2, 3 times. He was satisfied. He told me to get the guest list ready. We weren't going to Westchester, and we weren't going to the police, not yet. We were going to hold a meeting in the office, and the price of admission was going to be the truth. He instructed me to call Mrs. Vane and tell her to bring the board members, including Thorne and Arris, under the guise of a final settlement. He also told me to make sure Julian Vane was there, as a nephew's greed is often the best lubricant for a stuck door. I asked him if he was sure he wanted to bring the person who had broken into our kitchen back into the house. Wolfe looked at me, his eyes cold and hard. He said that a man who enters a house uninvited is a nuisance, but a man who enters a house and thinks he has escaped unnoticed is a fool. He wanted them all in one room, where the walls were thick and the exit was barred by me. He told me to tell Fritz that we would require beer for 6, and that the tension in the room would be the only appetizer provided. I spent the afternoon on the phone, watching the clock and feeling the weight of the Colt against my ribs. The brownstone was quiet again, but it was the quiet of a courtroom before the judge entered. Wolfe was back in his chair, motionless, waiting for the players to take their seats for the final act of a tragedy that had started in a lab and ended in a safe. The office atmosphere was as heavy as the humidity before a thunderstorm. I had spent the afternoon playing the part of a high society usher, arranging the yellow chairs in a semicircle facing Wolfe's desk. It's a chore I've done 100 times, but it never gets old watching the suspects walk in and try to look like Thea attending a dull lecture rather than a preliminary hearing for a trip to Sing Sing. First came Elena Vane, looking like Shed aged a decade in 48 hours, followed by Dr. Arris, who looked like he wanted to crawl inside his own pockets. Then came Julian, twitchy and smelling of gin, and finally the heavyweights, Marcus Thorne and Sybil Vance. Thorne entered with the air of a man who owned the building and was merely waiting for the lease to expire, while Vance scanned the room with professional coldness, her eyes lingering on the Bolt ID, just slid across the office door. Wolfe didn't greet them. He sat behind his desk, a mountain of immovable intent, watching them settle into their seats. He didn't even acknowledge Thorne's demand to know why a busy executive was being summoned to a brownstone on a Tuesday afternoon. Instead, Wolfe took a slow, deliberate sip of his beer and then turned his gaze toward the small metal box Saul had rescued from the incinerator. The box was sitting right there on the blotter, scorched and defiant, a silent witness that made Thorne's jaw tighten just a fraction of an inch. I stayed by the door, my back against the wood, looking as casual as a man can look when he's ready to intercept a flying tackle or a desperate bolt for the hallway. Wolfe began to speak, his voice a low, melodic rumble that filled the room without effort. He didn't start with the murder, he started with the chemistry. He lectured them on the instability of trifluoromethyl compounds and the peculiar ethics of a man who would market a miracle that turned into a toxin after 3 days. As he spoke, the room temperature seemed to drop. Dr. Arris began to shake, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white, while Thorne attempted to maintain a mask of bored contempt. But when Wolfe mentioned the midnight access logs from the Sterling Arris laboratory, the mask slipped. He pointed out that while Dr. Vane's heart may have stopped due to natural causes, the theft of his records was a very human endeavor, one that required a specific kind of keys and a specific kind of desperation. The strategic positioning was classic Wolfe. He wasn't accusing, yet he was weaving a net. He talked about the intruder who had broken into his kitchen, describing the shattered peppercorns as a symbol of intellectual cowardice. He looked directly at Sybil Vance when he said it, noting that a security expert should know that a threat only works if the person being threatened has something to fear. Since Nero Wolfe fears nothing but a poorly cooked meal or a world without books, the gesture had been a waste of good spice. Vance didn't blink, but I saw her fingers twitch toward her hamburger habit I made sure to track with more than passing interest. Wolfe then turned his attention to Julian Vane, the nephew who had been so eager to sell his uncle's secrets to cover his gambling debts. He revealed the floral receipt and the connection to the address in Queens, which turned out to be a private safe deposit facility where Julian had hoped to stash his inheritance. Julian started to blubber, protesting that he was a thief, sure, but not a killer. Wolfe cut him off with a flick of his finger. He wasn't interested in the small-time grift. He was looking at the bigger, picturesque corporate collapse that Thorne was trying to prevent and the scientific legacy that Arris was trying to reclaim. The tension was at its breaking point. A wire stretched until it hummed. Wolfe leaned forward, his massive bulk casting a shadow over the desk. He told them the formula was not just a secret, it was a confession. Whoever held the original journals held the evidence that Sterling Arris had known about the neurotoxin for months. He reached for the charred papers in the box, his movements slow and theatrical. He said that justice was like a chemical reaction. Once the catalyst was introduced, the result was inevitable. He looked from Thorne to Vance, his eyes hard and bright. The trap was fully set. The bait was the truth, and I could tell by the way the room had gone deathly silent that someone was about to scream. I shifted my weight, ready for the explosion. The office felt smaller than ever, a confined space where a decade of lies was finally being compressed into a single, lethal moment of clarity. Wolfe sat as still as a mountain in a summer drought, his eyes fixed on Marcus Thorne with a cold, unrelenting clarity. The office had become a pressurized chamber, and Wolfe was the only one who seemed to have enough oxygen. He tapped the charred box on his desk, the sound like a gavel in a tomb. He told the assembled group that the formula for the insulin stabilizer was not a treasure, but a death warrant, and that the man who had created it had been killed because his conscience had finally outweighed his ambition. Thorne tried to interrupt, his voice a practiced baritone of indignation, but Wolfe silenced him with a sharp, categorical wave of his hand. He told Thorne that his indignation was a tedious performance, and that we were far past the point of being moved by theatrical outrage. I stood by the door, watching Sybil Vance. She was the most dangerous person in the room because she was the only one who didn't seem to be sweating. While Dr. Arris looked ready to dissolve into a puddle of neuroses, and Julian was busy trying to find a way to disappear into the upholstery, Vance remained a statue of professional detachment. Wolfe turned his attention to her, noting that laboratory security was a broad term that, in her case, seemed to include the removal of inconvenient human obstacles. He pointed out that the empty vial of arsenic derivative Phi had found in the brownstone was a clumsy attempt at misdirection, a signature meant to implicate Dr. Arris. However, the real murder had been much more sophisticated. It hadn't been a poison at all, it had been a calculated withholding of medical intervention. Wolfe explained that Dr. Vane had been suffering from a mild heart condition, one that was easily managed by his regular medication. But someone had swapped his tablets for a placebo, a subtle switch that ensured a natural death at a highly convenient time for the corporation. He looked at Thorne and Vance, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He said that the theft of the formula from the safe had been the secondary objective. The primary goal was to ensure that the creator of the formula could never testify about its lethal side effects. The board meeting Thursday was meant to be a victory lap, a multi-million-dollar sale of a product that would have started killing patients within weeks of its release. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Dr. Aris sobbing quietly into his hands. He confessed, his voice a ragged whisper, that he had known about the placebo. He hadn't done the deed, but he had stood by and watched because he wanted his name back on the patents. He wanted the glory that Vane had stolen from him a decade ago, even if that glory was built on a foundation of corpses. Thorne looked at Aris with pure, unadulterated loathing, but he didn't deny the charge. He was a man who understood when a hand had been played to its end. He sat back, his face a mask of weary cynicism, and asked Wolfe what he intended to do with this collection of suppositions. Wolfe didn't answer him directly. Instead, he looked at me and told me to get Inspector Kramer on the phone. He said that while the evidence of the placebo might be difficult to prove after a burial, the evidence of the industrial sabotage and the attempted sale of a known toxin was sitting right there in the charred metal box. He had already contacted the insurance adjusters, and the paper trail of the failed batch was being reconstructed as we spoke. The room exploded into a cacophony of voices, Julian begging for a deal, Thorne shouting about legal repercussions, and Mrs. Vane finally finding her voice to demand justice for her husband. Through it all, Wolfe remained the calm center of the storm. He watched them with a look of profound boredom, as if they were a particularly uninteresting species of beetle he was forced to classify. He told them that justice was not a matter of emotion, but mathematics. The variables had been balanced, the equations solved, and the result was inevitable. I reached for the telephone, keeping my eyes on Sybil Vance, who had finally let the mask slip. She looked at the door, then at me, and then at the gun in my hand. She realized, as they all did, that the brownstone was no longer a sanctuary for them. It was a trap that had finally closed its jaws. Wolfe rang the bell for more beer, a signal that his work was nearly done, and that the rest was merely a matter of paperwork and police sirens. Inspector Kramer arrived 10 minutes later, bringing with him the usual cold wind and a face the color of a ripe pomegranate. He didn't even look at me as he stomped into the office, his eyes fixed on the collection of expensive suits and terrified expressions filling our yellow chairs. He stood in the center of the room, his coat still buttoned, looking like a man who had been interrupted in the middle of a very good cigar and was determined to make someone pay for it. Wolfe greeted him with a curt nod and a gesture toward the charred metal box on his desk, as if he were presenting a particularly rare orchid for inspection. He told Kramer that the trash in Westchester was far more informative than the boardrooms of Lexington Avenue, and that he would find the evidence of industrial homicide tucked neatly between the burned correspondence and the laboratory logs. Thorne tried to make a stand, blustering about his lawyers and the illegality of the search, but Kramer has a very low tolerance for corporate speeches when he smells a felony. He told Thorne to sit down and shut up, then turned to me and asked if I had the statements ready. I handed him my notebook, which contained the verbatim confession of Dr. Aris and the incoherent ramblings of Julian Vane. As Kramer's men began the process of herding the group toward the hallway, Sybil Vance made her move. It wasn't a desperate dash for the door, she was too smart for that. She reached into her bag, not for a weapon but for a small, pressurized canister. I was on her before she could break the seal, pinning her arm against the back of the red leather chair. The canister rolled across the floor, and I kicked it under Wolfe's desk. Wolfe didn't even flinch. He watched the struggle with the detached interest of a biologist watching a spider hunt. He told Kramer that Mrs. Vance was a woman of foresight, and that the canister likely contained a gaseous form of the very neurotoxin the company was trying to sell. It was her final attempt to ensure no one in that room would live to testify. Kramer looked at the canister, then at Vance, and his face went from red to a dangerous shade of purple. He didn't need any more convincing. He ordered his men to take them all out, including the sobbing Dr. Aris and the still protesting Julian. The brownstone, which had been crowded with the stench of greed and fear for the last 2 hours, suddenly felt vast and hollow as the front door finally clicked shut behind the last of them. Elena Vane remained in her chair, her face buried in her hands. She was the only one left, a woman who had come to us looking for a thief and had found a cabal of murderers instead. Wolfe looked at her, and for a brief moment the hardness in his eyes softened. He told her that her husband had been a man of significant flaws, but that his final act had been one of genuine courage. He had died trying to protect people he would never meet from a poison he had accidentally helped create. It wasn't much of a eulogy, but from Wolfe, it was the equivalent of a cathedral choir. He told her that my bill would be sent to the estate, and that she should go home and hire a good gardener, as the scent of lilies in her house was currently being overshadowed by the smell of corruption. Once she was gone, I walked around the room, straightening the chairs and opening the windows to let out the lingering scent of expensive perfume and cheap desperation. I picked up the canister from under the desk and placed it carefully on the blotter. I asked Wolfe if he knew she had. He told me that a security expert of her caliber would never walk into a trap without a way to burn the bridge behind her. He had counted on my reflexes to prevent a catastrophe, a compliment so backhanded it almost made my ears ring. He then rang the bell for Fritz, not for beer this time, but for the final course of our delayed dinner. The formula that killed in silence was now a matter for the district attorney, and as far as Nero Wolfe was concerned, the case was closed because it no longer interested his intellect or his appetite. He opened his book, a dense volume on 14th century architecture, and signaled that I was once again a free man, or at least as free as anyone can be when they work for a man who considers a war. The brownstone had settled back into its natural state of dignified silence, a silence so profound you could almost hear the dust motes deciding where to land. I stood by the window watching the tail lights of the last police cruiser vanish toward 10th Avenue. The fog had finally lifted, leaving the street looking scrubbed and indifferent to the fact that a $1 million conspiracy had just been dismantled in the room behind me. Fritz appeared in the doorway, his face no longer pale, carrying a tray with 2 glasses and a bottle of the good brandy. He knew the signs. The battle was over, the casualties had been processed, and the commander was ready to retreat into the fortress of his own satisfaction. Wolfe was already deep into his book, the light from the desk lamp illuminating his massive profile. He didn't look up as I poured the drinks. He didn't even acknowledge the fact that I had just spent the last 20 minutes giving a statement to a sergeant who couldn't spell neurotoxin without 3 tries. I sat at my desk and watched him for a moment. To the rest of the world, he was a recluse, a man who had built a wall of silk and stone to keep reality at bay. But sitting there, I realized that Wolfe didn't fear reality, he simply found it poorly organized. He spent his life tidying up the messes left by people who let their passions or their greed get in the way of their logic. The check from the Vane estate will be substantial, I said, taking a sip of the brandy. Enough to keep the orchids in climate-controlled luxury for a year, even if you decide to buy that ridiculous new hybrid from the Venezuelan collector. And I imagine the district attorney will be sending over a box of cigars, or at least a very polite letter, once they realize how much work we saved them on the grand jury presentation. Wolfe turned a page, his fingers moving with the delicacy of a master jeweler. Money is a necessity, Archie, not a triumph. It allows us to maintain the standards required for a civilized existence in a city that is increasingly becoming a wilderness of mediocrity. As for the district attorney, his gratitude is as fleeting as a summer cloud. He will forget my name the moment a new scandal arrives to occupy his limited intellect. I leaned back, feeling the warmth of the brandy settle into my bones. You have to admit, the business with the placebo was a nice touch. Thorne thought he was playing chess, but he didn't realize Yaud already counted every piece on the board before he even sat down. And Sybil Vance, I haven't seen a woman that cold since the last time I opened the freezer in the basement. She actually thought she could gas a room full of people and walk out like she'd just finished a light lunch. She was a technician, Wolfe murmured, his eyes never leaving the text. Technicians are often undone by their own efficiency. They forget that the human element is the most volatile chemical in any laboratory. They treat a murder like a production schedule, failing to account for the fact that a man's conscience, however dormant, can act as a catalyst at the most inconvenient moment. Dr. Vane's attempt to save the public was his only original thought in a decade of derivative work. It was that single spark of morality that provided the friction necessary to start the fire that consumed them. He finally closed the book, marking his place with a strip of blue silk. He looked at me, his eyes reflecting the amber light of the room. The formula was a failure, Archie, not because it was lethal, but because it was built on a foundation of theft and deception. You cannot stabilize a life-saving medicine with the blood of the man who discovered its flaws. It is a fundamental law of ethics, though I suppose the modern corporate world considers such things an archaic inconvenience. I grinned. Well, ethics and lamb kidneys make for a long day. If you don't need me to tuck you in, I think I'll head out for a bit. There's a girl at the Flamingo who thinks I am an insurance investigator, and I'd hate to ruin her evening with the truth. Wolfe's lips puckered in a ghost of a smile. Go then, but be back by 8. Fritz is preparing a shad roe with a sorrel sauce that requires your presence to be fully appreciated. And Archie, make sure you don't bring any of the Flamingo's atmosphere back into this house. I have had quite enough of the scent of desperation for 1 week. I grabbed my hat, giving him a mock salute. As I walked out into the cool night air, I heard the faint clink of his glass hitting the desk. The office was quiet, the case was closed, and the world was once again a place where a man could get a decent meal without worrying about who had tampered with the salt. It was a good ending, even if it didn't have a punchline. Sometimes, in the brownstone, the only thing that matters is that the silence is earned.